So hello everyone and welcome today to another edition of The Verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today I'm going to be looking at the exclusive to the Switch JRPG Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Just this past week, I think, I finished it with my good friend Surger2 acting as, sort of co-op commentary. And I have to say that while it was a very enjoyable experience, I absolutely enjoyed it. It was very funny. To sort of, shoot the shit with Surger1 in certain things about the game, because I think we both, at some fundamental level, enjoy it. But unfortunately for me, this game, while very good and while fun, just has a lot of foibles about it that I find just to be very annoying. And especially since I don't want to say intimately, but very, very familiar and very much a fan of the last game in the series, which is Xenoblade Chronicles X, which is a completely different setting, but very similar gameplay. I really don't understand what the changes were with this game, in such a way that they kind of oversimplified stuff, but at the same time kept a lot of things very complex. So I'm actually going to get into that, but the first thing I want to get out the way is the stuff I like, because it's very easy to talk and rant about the stuff I didn't like about a game, but I do want to stress what I like about a game. So for the first thing, I think that definitely when you compare this to X and the games that came before it, Chronicles 2, because I'm going to end up calling it X2 at some point for really no reason. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 looks very nice. It has a nice art style, and like I said throughout numerous times in the playthrough, it looks like a Tales game. The characters look very well defined, as opposed to trying to go for like realistic looking characters like what they did kind of with X. They sort of adapted a more cartoonish anime style filter for the entire world, all the characters. And it looks nice, especially when you play JRPGs, they tend to do this a lot to try to give a little bit more diversity and uniqueness to the world around you. And I think that it looks very nice in X, as I said, at Chronicles 2, because Chronicles 2 definitely is eye-popping at points, and even when it's not its worst. I like the filters, I like the things that they do in the environments. It just looks nice as a game. Additionally, I think that the soundtrack and the sounds in the game are pretty good. The presentation of this game is pretty damn good. The only thing I will say is that I believe that X had a better soundtrack, just in terms of fighting and combat and stuff like that. I think that the music was just slightly better in X, which is cool and all. But for the most part, I think that the presentation is fine. There's not really anything that the game lacks too much, except... And this might be a slightly minor issue because it's not as bad as some of the things that are actually not that great about this game. But one of the biggest problems with this game, possibly owing to the fact that a lot of people are saying it was rushed, is that the game does not load very quickly. A lot of times you'll load in and textures still won't be loaded in, and then it all pops in at once. And just even if they had to extend the load time by maybe a second or two, it would be nice to try to hide that a bit more. I don't know why the game has to pop in that much. And we know that the Switch can handle other more powerful games, more taxing games than Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So it's really just a lack of optimization. And I do kind of feel like, yeah, the game probably was pushed out to facilitate an earlier launch as opposed to hemming up some of these issues. But that's more of an issue in execution and more of an issue of just polishing. Let's talk about some of this stuff a little bit deeper than that. So the story of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 revolves around a young boy by the name of Rex, who essentially wants to save the world from its eventual demise by essentially leading all the people of the world to this place called Elysium, where people can live in happiness and have good lives and enjoy themselves. All of the people that exist live on the backs of these creatures called Titans. And basically what Titans do is they're gigantic. The game tries to portray them as continental size. They're a little smaller to facilitate gameplay, but they're essentially gigantic continents that swim or walk around this place called the Cloud Sea, which is, as the name suggests, a sea of clouds orbiting and around this gigantic tree called the World Tree. And the Titans, since they're living beings that all life lives in and around and on, since they themselves are living, eventually they die. And so the game sort of takes this somber tone that, you know, time is kind of running out. The architect, who's believed to be this godlike entity at the top of the World Tree, holds the key to their salvation, but people need to actually get to Elysium at the top of the World Tree in order to meet him to potentially save or destroy the world. And so that's basically how the game starts off. Rex gets involved with this by pulling up a sword called the Aegis, which sprouts into a blade called Pyra. Blades being these creatures that bond themselves to living humans or other, you know, human folk, such as the cat-like Gormati, and so on and so forth. And Pyra promises him to take her to Elysium, and the story progresses from there. While I like the story, and I think that it's pretty interesting, at least from start to finish, one of the things I will say is that it does kind of tend to drag on in terms of cutscenes. I think that they kind of reiterate points a little bit too much within a short window. So you'll have a cutscene that tells you everything you need to do, and then immediately right after there will be another cutscene that tells you what you need to do. And then when you walk 5 feet, there will be another cutscene that further elaborates on it. It's a very Kojima-style storytelling from like Metal Gear Solid 2 and 1 and 3, but it doesn't exactly go any faster. It doesn't really speed things up at all. It's very slow-paced, to the point that I would almost say that it could have been sped up. A lot of the non-important stuff could have been sped up, and it could have just saved time and just got us back into the action. Additionally, there's a lot of just twists and turns in the story, which I think are fine. I like that. I enjoy it. It keeps you guessing. It's unique. There's a lot of cool references and stuff. So overall, I don't have too much negative to say about the story, other than the fact that it just kind of drags on at some points with unnecessary cutscenes. I like how it starts off strong. It kind of meanders towards the center, but it's definitely a bottom-heavy story. The last 3 or 4 chapters being, like people have been saying, fairly short, but at the same time pretty story-rich, story-intensive, which is kind of, I mean, how most JRPGs I feel are, except for some classics and stuff like that. But I think that one of the things that this plot could probably have benefited from is more consistency, is more just sort of spinning down of the unnecessary elements, or spinning them off into meaningful little branch stories that would, you know, kind of go hand in hand with the game. And to that end, one of the things I'm not going to do for this this verdict is to show off anything too late in the story, because the story does vastly change the more you play it. Stuff happens in the overworld, characters come and go. It's one of those like old school style Final Fantasy games in a way, which is pretty neat. But additionally, I think that perhaps the most flawed part of this game is the gameplay, and specifically the execution of it. The biggest problems I have with this game stem from the gameplay. And part of that problem is that most Xenoblade games are very weird with combat. So let's just start with the combat. The combat of Xenoblade is very similar to what I would say like a action RPG MMO hybrid. So there's a certain degree of just auto attacks that just naturally happen, but at the same time there's player interaction involving with combos and various things. Each character that you control is bound to a blade, and each blade gives you certain perks, gives you certain abilities depending on the weapon that they use. And it's nice to kind of be able to get that sort of diversity going on in this game. So for instance, some blades will have you use gigantic axes, and that's, you know, slower auto attacks but some more damage, and maybe you get access to more powerful moves. Some blades let you use knuckle-like weapons, which are just quick hits. The Pyra, for instance, has a blade that is a sword, which is basically what Rex uses for most of the game, and so on and so forth. Each blade is unique in a way. Maybe this game could have probably benefited from more weapons. I mean, it has a pretty decent pool, so I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that one of the biggest problems with the combat is that Xenoblade games have combat that is, I almost want to say, very luck-based. Because you cannot change who you control in the middle of combat, and this game runs off of the tank healer attacker system that you see in a lot of games, MMOs, so on and so forth. It begins to have a lot of problems. So, for instance, your tank, if you're not controlling the tank, may just decide to stand in a pool of poison. And the AI for tanks is pretty poor, to the point that they will rather stand there and just take everything coming at them while standing in poison, rather than try to relocate and get into a new position and then move and try something different. So one of the worst fights in the game, which is, I think, at the end of chapter like 7 or 8, basically is like the pinnacle of everything bad about this game. You can't really, unless you play as the tank, which means you're not necessarily making the best calls as a DPS, what's going to happen is your tank has the potential to eventually, either through enemies knocking them back into it or just general repositioning, will stand in a pool of poison, or they'll do something poor that they shouldn't do. And that's the kind of thing that in other games you can kind of rectify. Like in Tales games, you can sort of give people strategy, and this is something they've scaled down in Tales games in some games, and I have said the same thing about that. In Final Fantasy XII, for instance, you can manually control people and reposition them to whatever effect you want. In other games, like, for instance, Fire Emblem Warriors, which is a game that came out recently, you can freely command people to go where they need to go, even people you can't directly control as, but are still on your team. And this game is very luck-based, in the sense that an entire boss fight could be a complete shit show, and you get completely fucked, or one random time you'll just pass it with no difficulty. And that's not to say there's no consistency in the game. It's just that this game has less than what you would expect from even the most basic of JRPGs, or RPGs in general. Sometimes a boss will perfectly counter and combo all his moves together in such a way that he nullifies your heals and you can't heal. He perfectly blows everyone back. He counters everything. He murders the tank because you can't heal. And that might happen, sure. That's a very clear outcome. And then sometimes he'll just lay down and fucking die for no reason, and it's very inconsistent in that regard. Even in the overworld, and boss fights might be their own shtick. I think that the boss fights in this game are actually better than the boss fights of X, in the sense that a lot of them are very understandable. The general flow of combat in this game is that on whatever enemy you're attacking, you are trying to basically build up orbs. So each blade has an element, and each element, as you fight with this blade and use your non-auto attack abilities, you can use these things called blade specials. And blade specials are basically powerful moves, but the real strength from them comes from building them up. So for the first one you use in a fight will be a level 1. And then from there on after, to combo with it along a certain chart that the game gives you in the top right corner, you combo it into another blade skill that either you or your teammates have. So you can basically mix and match who you want to use them. And the goal is to hit your level 3 combo, so that way you can leave an orb on the enemy and do big damage. And this is kind of what the end game gameplay of the game is. You're trying to build up all these different elemental orbs to enter chain attack, and once you do that, you can do a ton of damage, possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands to millions. And it's its own nice, fun gameplay. I do like it. Most RPGs are generally about beating an enemy down, and while you can do burst and whatnot, and you can hit them hard and hit them a lot, this game, you kind of don't really hit anyone that hard. Enemies have a fuck ton of health. You don't really do much damage comparatively, but the goal is to get them into a chain attack with as many elemental orbs as possible, and that is fun. I do like that, if that's what they're going for, and it's fine, and I don't mind that. And of course there's other things to do in combat, such as toppling enemies. You can launch them. There's a whole combo chain you can do with that for bigger damage. And it's pretty fun trying to do that. But the problem, like I said, is that boss fights and in general some fights in this game can completely go your way for 3 seconds, and then immediately you just get face rolled. It's also that combat takes too long. If you want to fight every single enemy in your way, as though this were a traditional RPG, most Tales games, fights in the overworld don't last more than a minute, maybe 2 minutes at most. And even then, once you get towards the higher end of the game, usually you have some strategies or some cool moves or something that really make things fast. Like, you're never laxing, slowly tugging your way through a fight. Most fights are pretty short and pretty easy to complete. In this game, and especially in Final Fantasies, especially the old school ones, this game, it just takes too long to kill anything. You'll spend maybe 3 to 4 minutes fighting 5 enemies at equal level or less, and at any point, something bad could happen. Your healer could fall off a cliff and have to relocate, and then the whole, balance of the fight can tip the complete opposite direction. And part of the problem is that you essentially have to approach every fight like it's a boss fight in order to quickly speed through it, but it'll still take you way too long. So by the end of the game, and I know that this is the same thing I did in X, but X was a little bit better about it because X was more open world. I was just skipping enemies. There was no point. Touching a ladder immediately makes you exit combat. Running too far will make them leash off of you. I didn't even want to be bothered fighting it because it will take way too long in order to complete a lot of this stuff. And to that end, that's one of the things I really think this game kind of is poor at, is that monsters in the overworld and enemies in the overworld do not give you enough reward to justify fighting them and taking so long. It just gets very tedious and tiring around the time you hit like level 20. And that's pretty early on because the game ends at like level 60, level 70. So that, in my opinion, is one of the foibles of this game. It's not a very intuitive design. Also, when enemies die, you have to manually run near their drops in order to pick them up. But while you're moving, you can't auto-attack, unlike in previous Xenoblade games. Nor can you use your other moves because that will force you to target your enemy, and drops will eventually disappear. It's a pretty short timer. I don't know why that is. I don't know why drops are not instant pickup. They are instant pickup, however, if you are completing a boss fight or a story fight. So in their defense, they did kind of do something that a lot of games tend to mess up with, is that when you defeat a boss, the game just takes you into a cutscene. It may or may not give you the items you won, which is cool and all. But like I said, this game is pretty decent about boss fights, but not so much about normal combat, which is what 90% of your combat, ideally in an RPG, should be. It should be about exploring the open world and fighting open world combat against, generic mobs. That's how RPGs work. Unless the game is a boss rush, but I don't know very many boss rush RPGs. Another thing about this game is that Xeno games are known for open world. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 had a pretty big open world. Xenoblade Chronicles X was defined by this massive open world with a gigantic ecosystem where you're sort of interacting with the planet Mira and seeing all sorts of different life forms of varying sizes and levels, and everything sort of feels like a threat. You really do feel like at the start of the game you are at the bottom of the food chain, and most of the game revolves around you, sort of raising yourself up, leveling and learning new tactics to kind of overcome that. And while it is frustrating in its own regard, it is very rewarding to actually achieve success in the game and to find stuff that works for you. Whereas in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, yeah, the game is open world, and the first couple of areas you go are pretty nice about it, but the game is pretty linear. The game, and I don't necessarily believe that this is a result of the game being rushed. I just think that this is a result of the game ultimately just being short, or not short, excuse me. It's just a result of the game just trying to be more simplified. The game being easier to comprehend and understand. The game being more straightforward. So you spend less time mucking about this game, trying to figure out where to go and how to avoid enemies and stuff. And the game is pretty straightforward. Like, most of the areas are A to B. There are places to go to explore on the side, but it's not nearly to the same degree as Xenoblade Chronicles X. So the reward, the feeling of reward that you get from doing a lot of this stuff is kind of diminished in this game compared to X, because it's just very straightforward, which is nice, because if you just want to follow the story, then that's fine. It's very easy, very simple. You're not necessarily killing yourself to try and do it, but by that same token, that is something that is taken right away from Xeno games. That is almost atypical, and I do kind of miss that, because it added more to the game. It gave you an incentive to go out and explore the world. And X did it pretty decently, because, you know, they tried to show it as, oh, well, you do this, you get skills, you can get more money, you can find more salvage points, and it sort of made sense in the grand scheme of the game. And especially since that game was very storyline light, and it was more about exploring the world and gameplay, this game kind of doesn't do it as good as 1, which was a story-heavy game, nor does it do it as good as 2. It sort of sits, or excuse me, as good as X, and it sort of sits in the middle, you know, not fulfilling either camp's goals, where it should be trying to aspire to do both. This game is sort of like the jack of all trades. It's a fairly linear game that is fulfilling and fun when it's good, but when it's bad, it's really questionable and just not fun at some points. Additionally, the game, like I said, it's fairly linear. The rewards, or the leveling up for various things, for your cities and stuff, takes a lot longer. They put a lot of it into these timed merc missions, which are basically where you dispatch blades. And while I do like this kind of system in a game, I think that this one requires a lot of micromanagement, especially for some missions. And a lot of blades have growth linked to this, which is kind of annoying. Leveling up blades and increasing their affinity charts, it's not the worst thing ever. It at least gives you a thing to do for all of them. So I think almost every blade in the game that is unique and a rare definitely has a quest that's interesting to do, but a lot of it is a lot of legwork, it's a lot of dialogue, and thankfully for the most part you're not punished too heavily if you just want to go through the game with it, but it just feels like it's very roundabout. It takes you back to areas you've already been to, and it just feels like a letdown coming from X, where the story of X, it was only 12 missions, give or take. Some of them are kind of forced, as in, like, you know, they're pretty straightforward. But for the most part, the number one thing that annoys me about this game is the triad, the sort of MMO style system they kind of force into this game. You're only allowed to have 3 party members at any given point. And while each party member can equip 3 different blades, giving them a total of 9 different blades to potentially use out of the 8 elements in the game, one of the annoying things about it is that I feel like if the enemies are going to have this much health and take this much time to kill, if the world is going to be, you know, if the boss fights are going to fluctuate between piss baby easy and completely luck-based RNG, the least they could do is make this like a standard MMO and make it a 4-man party operation. There's some boss fights that you have to fight a lot of enemies and a lot of mobs in addition to stuff, and even just some normal fights where enemies will summon reinforcements, and it would be nice to have that extra DPS if everything is going to take like a minute of dedicated focusing to kill, you know, turning all these fights into like 10-minute ordeals, or just sometimes dragging on way too long. It would be nice, the more DPS the better, and this game could have probably benefited from that. On the flip side of that, everyone in the game, besides one party member who is fairly annoying to try to level up, everyone in the game does sort of require that you play this RNG roulette called bonding blades. And basically what it is that everyone throughout the world and throughout battle, you'll get these crystals that will drop, and these crystals, when used on your party members, have the potential to give them new blades. Now, this game has a pretty generic pool of typical blades, of random elements, of random everything. And obviously, common blades, I mean, they work, they'll help you, they have different weapons and stuff. But really, like most games like this, the only ones you really care about are the rare blades, the ones that give you special abilities, unique stuff, such as more damage against bosses, or healing on switch, and so much and so forth. And I think that part of the problem with this game is that you need to have blades on people to make them relevant. Additionally, because you can only have 3 people, you can't really have enough damage, I would want to say, to make it worthwhile. And if that's what the game is going for, the game needs to either lean towards one of 2 things. Every fight takes a long time, which is fine, some games do that, but every fight gives you a substantial reward based on your area and based on what you do, and therefore it's worth engaging in all these fights to level up, or to gain items, or to gain various things. Or every fight is quick, but every fight doesn't reward as much, but you can very quickly get through every fight, and that way you're not spending too much time on any one thing. Additionally, because this open world is not as open world as X, one of the things that ends up happening is that they kind of compressed the fact that you're around a bunch of high-level mobs all around you, and at some points you'll be fighting enemies or whatever, just traveling about, and a high-level, level 80 mob is just going to show up and ruin your day. And, I mean, what can you realistically do? Running away is almost never an option, because you have to put your weapon away, which leads you open to crits as you try to run away, unless they're too focused on your teammates. And you can't fight them. You know, they will probably one-shot you. Now, there are a few things I do like about this game over X specifically. To revive people, because there's no revive magic. The healing magic in this game is pretty limited, which is also a negative in my opinion. They have a healer role set, but you can't really make them into real healers. You just make them drop potions, and occasionally they'll have heal moves, maybe. Basically, only one party member is an actual healer, and even then, somewhat. And another thing that I don't like about healing in this game is that all heals are essentially bound to your ability to hit the enemy. All your art cooldowns are more or less, I mean, there are items to kind of facilitate not having to rely on this, but for the most part, the general concept of this game is that you hit enemies with auto attacks, and that restores your arts. It basically lessens their cooldown, unlike the timer-based cooldowns of MMOs and Xenoblade Chronicles X. And that's kind of one of the annoying things, because if you can't hit the enemy, you can't restore your cooldowns, which means you can't heal. So one of the annoying things that enemies will start to do, which they probably shouldn't do at all in the game, is enemies will start to have massive evasion stats. They will completely start to dodge everything you throw at them, and when they do that, you won't be able to hit them, which means you won't be able to heal. And one of the more annoying fights in the game involves that, in addition to nullifying your heal when you are able to heal. It just becomes a mess of mechanics that you can't really do much about. You know, if your tank is standing under something that's causing them gradual damage or making enemies stronger, you can't relocate them, you can't give them orders, you can't tell them to do anything else. And again, I think that's one of the flaws of this game. They probably just should not have that in the game at all. But yeah, one of the things I do like about this game is that you're never really under-leveled. This game goes out of its way to give you some experience for fighting, but also when you discover new locations, complete quests, and a whole bunch of other stuff, you gain bonus experience that you can cash in at an inn to level up and get free levels, basically. So you're never really under-leveled, but leveling is not really the problem here. I mean, obviously it makes a big help to be at the same level, but that doesn't alleviate the other issues with the game. The other issues of the game exist even when you're over the level of your enemies. And while I do like that this game has a healing system over X, which didn't really have one besides soul challenges, would it kill them to put an actual real healer in the game? Would it actually, like, physically harm them to just make a character and the majority of their abilities, especially when wielding healer-type blades, and in general, just being a healer-designated character, would it kill them to make the character just focused around healing? That's how old Final Fantasies and other games work. There's always one character who is like a designated healer, and when they're not, and you know, it's very typical of an MMO. When they're not healing, they DPS, but the primary focus of that character is to heal. They have an MP pool, they have the ability to regenerate their MP or something, they do a variety of things, and what you'll see is in a lot of Tales games, there's always one character that runs like a healer, or there's two characters that sort of off-heal together. When you play Final Fantasies, there's always generally one character you want to have who's good with healing. So, like, you know, and that's just, in general, how most RPGs go. You have someone who is a designated person who keeps you alive. This game has that designated person. They don't really want to, like, but because they're bound to how much they can attack, while they also have to focus on DPSing, I mean, it's just really like a clusterfucky system. I feel that the UI could probably be a bit more contained because there's a lot of stuff flying all over the screen. But otherwise, I mean, it's not completely unlikable and unbearable. I'd say that the worst part is just the fact that there's a lot of enemies that take way too long to kill. Like, even if they're not going to completely destroy you, it'll still take you way too long to kill them. At some point, unless you like spending 10 minutes per fight in an area, and then if you die, you have to start over, you have to kill them all again, or there's, you know, a 10-minute cutscene every, you know, 5 minutes of running, which amounts to 50 minutes of endless, you know, RPG-style battles. I mean, if that's your thing, then this game is the perfect time sink for you. But I don't really like it. I think it takes way too long to accomplish the most basic of things. And in general, there's just a lot of stuff that could be hemmed up. I feel like a game that combines the best of this game. Also, each blade only has 3 attack slots, and that, in my opinion, is way too little. Each blade has 4 moves. You can only equip 3. And part of the reason why a lot of people say that the combat is so passive is because essentially, when you're not actively using combos or anything, you're basically auto-attacking, waiting for your blade gauges to refill so you can cancel into your blade moves to do big damage to build your special. And what should be a quick system ends up just dragging on and being just very not user driven. There's not a lot of interaction. You're just making auto attacks. Whereas in other Xenoblade games, your auto attacks were auto, and you could freely, you know, timer based your cooldowns to fight alongside of them and to use them in conjunction with your autos. Here, you're basically sort of feeding this gigantic auto machine to use more abilities. And like I said, this game is not bad. It's far from the worst RPG or JRPG I've ever played. It's not terrible. It's just that the story, I mean, if you like anime tropes and you like a whole bunch of stuff and you like waifus and whatnot, then, or at least can tolerate it like I do, then it's not bad. I think that the story is one of the game's strong points, and it's definitely a refreshing one. It's definitely a satisfying conclusion. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of problems with the gameplay, and unfortunately, an RPG, especially more so than almost any other game type, needs to have solid gameplay. The story needs to be good. Like, everything in a game needs to be good. But some games can get away with having wonky or weird mechanics in the gameplay if the story is good, provided they're short. Let's you know, like Heavy Rain type stuff. You know, for a variety of games that are more narrative driven, like LA Noire and stuff. They can have weird combat controls and stuff because the game is about the story. The game is about the narrative decisions and how it's presented. A game that takes this long or has a long playtime, generally speaking, it has to have better gameplay than story. I would put gameplay on the heavier axis than story because we need something that will want people to stick around for potentially 50 to 100 hours. And this game sort of slogs on at a point. And while it is fun to play, I can't deny some of the really lacking features of the game. So what would I give Xenoblade Chronicles to? Well, I wouldn't give it as high as what I would give Xenoblade X. That's a starter, because Xenoblade X, in my opinion, is a better game through virtue of having better gameplay. And while the story in this game, in X, was definitely harder to complete and much more lax in the sense that it's very, 12 missions basically, and then a whole bunch of side missions. This game is essentially a narrative from A to B, and that's good, but it's not good enough to hide the gameplay. So, I mean, I never did a verdict on X, but if I were to give X a review, I would give it like an 88, 89, because it's a very satisfying, fun game that changes time and time again. And that's why I like X so much, and that's kind of why I don't like this game. I'd give Xenoblade Chronicles 2 an 82 out of 100. And the reason why I would give it that is because the gameplay, just in and of itself, everything I listed about the gameplay has to take off at least like 12 or 13 points. It's just unforgivable at some points. But when it fluctuates. It fluctuates between being tolerable but with little niblets here and there, or just downright shit. And at the points where it's really bad, it's really bad. But at the points where the game is good, it's fun, it's enjoyable, and stuff. There's a lot of funny stuff in the story. The story fluctuates between being light and dark, which is nice, and I do enjoy it. I think that maybe it's not the best juxtaposition, but on some level, the story is fulfilling in that regard. So I like that. And, yeah, I mean, for the most part, the game is not bad, like I said, but I can't forgive some of the gameplay stuff. At least in other games, everyone's a DPS, so it's a little bit nicer. The world was more open-ended, and there was a lot more reason and incentive to explore. But, yeah, I was really not too pleased by a lot of the negatives of the game, but I was still thoroughly engrossed in it from start to finish, so that's going to be it for this verdict. I am SpraynPray1000, and I will see you guys next time for another verdict. So, yeah, I will see you guys later.